Hello, everybody. I'm Devoney Looser, professor of English at Arizona State University, and it is my pleasure to be here with you today at virtual JaneCon 2021. I'm going to talk to you today about literary history and myths and women who hustle. Literary history is chock full of myths. You don't have to dig too deeply to realize that the very literary history that we draw on, create, and recreate is rife with myths and myth making. Eventually we come to call them errors, right? But we can only recognize partially correct or incorrect interpretations as persistent myths when we're willing to acknowledge that we as critics, scholars, historians, and readers are also argument makers and storytellers who sometimes get things right, but who may also get things partially or fully wrong. So myth busting is having a kind of moment, even in literary history. And I especially appreciate the goals of this book series from Blackwell Publishing, which is seeking a wider audience to make sense of longstanding and dismantling longstanding mistaken beliefs. The humanities titles in this series tackle larger than life figures and movements that the public may already care about, as you can see from these covers. Now, I recommend to you the book in the series on Jane Austen by Claudia Johnson and Clara Tooch because it's just really excellent. I was also grateful last year to get a chance to contribute to the Washington Post's 5 Myths column and feature with an invited piece on Jane Austen. One of the things that the 5 Myths series does is it asks contributors to provide links to reputable places online where the identified myths continue to circulate. So researching for the story was actually a lot of fun because for a change, when I found a misleading statement about Austen or an outright error about her life or her writings, instead of experiencing the typical disappointment or rage I might normally feel, I could actually get kind of temporarily excited about it. It felt like I was doing a little bit for literary history what Snopes.com does for urban legends. So in my talk today, the first half of it, I'm going to discuss some myths in 19th century British women's writings, the history of the novel, and research that tries to address them through old and new methods and data. Then I'm going to share a little bit of my research in progress from the biography I'm completing on 2 sister novelist contemporaries of Jane Austen's that you might never have heard of, Jane and Anna Maria Porter. They were famous sister novelists, probably the most famous sister novelists before the Brontes. And I see my work on the Porter sisters as a different kind of myth-busting project. It's one that relies on storytelling through archivally drawn facts. So I've thought a lot about myths busting and why it is so important to me when I wrote my last book, The Making of Jane Austen. I began that project, as some of you know, with some freshly unearthed evidence that seemed to undo a limiting myth about early so-called cults and cultures that had formed around Jane Austen's afterlife. That it was said that those cults and cultures were once dominated by elite men. But once I set out to investigate and understand that myth's origins, I realized it was actually based on a far greater myth, that Austen was largely unknown until 1870. Now, it's not true. And you'll still read that claim circulating lots of places today. But that realization brought me face to face with the truth that the obscurity of Jane Austen, this obscurity that she supposedly faced in the decades after her death, was entirely overblown. So my experience in writing and publishing that book and in seeing it into the world only confirmed for me how crucial it is that more of us seek ways and new places and new media in which to bust myths. If we care about getting stories of the past told or retold in less partial, more just, and more accurate ways. Now, whether or not you're a teacher or professor listening to this talk, you probably know that there are many 19th century British women writers, including many who are successful and even famous in their own day, who ended up disappearing from the literary canon, from our classrooms and from having many new readers. Clifford Siskin calls it the great forgetting. And that's a fabulous, catchy, memorable phrase, which comes from his 1998 book, The Work of Writing. In it, Siskin writes, "There is much remembering to be done, and we need to find out how we forgot." So Siskin further describes his phenomenon that he identifies as great forgetting as having become what later would be called the Great Tradition. And Siskin invokes the name of literary critic F.R. Leavis in his influential 20th century book called The Great Tradition. And I have to tell you, I didn't realize till I was preparing these images that Siskin's book cover design was echoing F.R. Leavis's, and that looks pretty intentionally, right? Amazing. So Siskin argues that the Great Forgetting resulted in the neglect of virtually every British woman writer in the period 1700 to 1830 who wasn't Jane Austen. And we might add who wasn't Mary Shelley. The Great Forgetting, or all of these little cumulative forgettings, was eventually experienced by hundreds of early 19th century novelists, many of them women. Some of them even watched as it happened to them, if they were fortunate enough to live into old age. A few seem to have just gone away quietly, but others kept hustling, trying to continue to get their work before readers. And we're coming to the point now where we can almost say precisely how many of these novelists were active and forgotten. Thanks to the work of scholars, we know that there were about 3,000 novels published in Britain from the mid-18th to the early 19th century. What's interesting is that more than half of these novels were published with some form of anonymity. Now, a well-known epigram tells us that Anonymous was a woman, but evidence about known authors suggests that the picture is actually a bit more complicated than that. We now have data to drill down into those numbers in various ways. A great gift of the past decade for those of us who research and teach in the early 19th century is the freely available database British Fiction 1800 to 1829. It's fun to search around in it, or maybe I just have a warped idea of fun, but it's also great to use with students, friends, if you're teaching fiction from this period, if you're just like exploring little known ideas and texts from this period. For example, you might look up in the database the number of novels published in 1808, the year that the anonymous novel, The Woman of Color, was published. Now, it's a fascinating story of a mixed race heroine that's now being widely read and taught, because one reason why that's possible is because it's now available in a great modern edition, edited by Linda Dominique and published by the fabulous Broadview Press. So this fascinating novel may or may not be by a mixed race author. It features a mixed race heroine. It may or may not be by a female author. And I really hope that someone in the coming years is going to discover more about the circumstances of this book's publication and authorship. But there is some data we have now that we could certainly use to try to understand this novel in context, based on the text that we know surrounded it. So in that year, 1808, the number of novels published in Britain has been identified by scholars as 111. Of that number, 19, or almost a fifth, were published anonymously. So that's a year with far lower than average number of anonymous books relative to the entire period. Of those 111 novels, 49 were published by authors who set out to be identified as women, as female. So strictly statistically speaking, the gender of those anonymously authored novels might also be a complete toss-up, that is almost 50-50. Of course, there isn't a way yet to identify how many of these novels were published under a taken rather than a given name, but it is known that male authors in the first decades of the 19th century might even have chosen to publish under female pseudonyms, unlike what we see a generation later with authors like the Brontes. Now, perhaps that's because in the early 19th century, the novel was popularly understood as a female-dominated genre. Interestingly, women were not quite the majority of novel writers in this period. The year 1808 was typical in terms of gender authorship in the novel in this way, but between 1800 and 1819, the numerical advantage of identifiable authorship of novels by sex slightly favors men. 300 to 295, but it's close to half. Now, here's one further thing that scholars have been able to deduce. Among those authors known to have published 5 or more novels in this period, 2/3 were women. And of those who published 10 or more titles, 3/4 were. So what that means is that prolific novelists skewed female in this period. So if the woman of color really did publish all of those other titles listed in the advertisement we saw a moment ago, then statistically speaking, the likelihood is that the book was female authored. The preponderance of prolific novelists who were female may also serve to help to explain why the genre of the novel came to be described for a time as a female-dominated form. Now, by the 1820s, the numbers split even further in favor of a clear majority of male novelists or male producers of novelists publishing as male. Austen died at the moment that the novel was beginning to skew masculine, with producers more often imagined as men. Yet there are still educated readers who mistakenly believe that there were very few women writers, or perhaps there are a few published women writers in the early 19th century. So we need better ways to describe and visualize both the field as a whole, as well as its individual players, in order to continue to address and undo these myths. Scholars are testing theories that critics then affirmed, that novels started to be understood as male because of the runaway success of one author, Sir Walter Scott, who published the anonymous Waverley in 1814, and then went on to publish 27 novels, all but one of which we'd class as historical novels. When readers talk about Scott at all today, which is increasingly rarely, they still may repeat the truism, Scott invented the historical novel. That deserves to be classified as a myth. By making Scott into the great originator, as we might call him, many innovative titles and pioneering authors of his own day came to be erased. There's Sophia Lee's The Recess from 1783. Even Jane Austen's mother's cousin, Cassandra Cook, published a historical novel. Her Battle Ridge was published in 1799 under the gendered anonymity of By a Lady of Quality. Very interesting, right? But there's no one who got more ripped off by the myth of Scott as the great originator of the historical novel than Jane Porter. And that's the myth that I'm currently most interested in busting, not only by saying it loudly anywhere I can, but by trying to find ways to tell the story of her life, career, and literary achievements in ways that will resonate. Jane Porter was, for a time, arguably the most famous author Jane of the early 19th century, though few readers and even few scholars of this period fully grasp this fact. That's because compared to Austen's studies, Porter's studies is tiny. I've been one of a handful of academics and librarians, many of them at the places where the Porter manuscripts are housed, at the Spencer Library at the University of Kansas, the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and the New York Public Library in New York, who've been working to document Porter's importance to literary history. Now, for those of you who write about Jane Austen, know about Jane Austen, and read Jane Austen's work, you know that there's likely to be a large and avid audience who already care about her work when something is published. So, when anything is discovered, you know that there are people there who are going to want to know it. We also know that finding any new material by her or even about her or her family is a rare event. Just 161 of her letters are known to survive. If even a scrap of her writing is discovered or reemerges, that's headline making. By contrast, for Jane Porter, there is no ready audience to speak of anymore. Few today have ever heard of her, although her best-selling novel, her best-known novel, continued to be popular enough into the 20th century that it was adapted into a Classics Illustrated comic book in the 1950s. Also, by contrast with Jane Austen, there's so much material that's documented that survived to document Jane Porter's life that a person could almost drown in it. I wanted you to get a visual of that. So this is the Porter family material at the University of Kansas's Spencer Library. It consists of 2,900 items. At the three major repositories in the United States of the Porter family manuscripts that I named, there are almost 7,000 items. So there are also repositories with hundreds of items elsewhere in North America and Europe especially. And just to bring it further to life for you, an item might be either something like this tracing for ordering a stocking. It might be this lock of hair. This is Jane Porter's hair. Or it might be this dozens and dozens of page letter. In the first half of the 19th century, Jane Porter was one of the most famous novelists, period, male or female. What she experienced in the century after her death was less of a great forgetting and more of a gradual forgetting. In the year of her death, 1850, one obituary writer complained, "It is singular that so little notice has been taken of the demise of Jane Porter, one of the most distinguished novelists which England has produced." And notice that the writer doesn't say distinguished women novelists, distinguished novelist, period, not identified by gender. Now, to thicken this plot, Jane Porter had a sister, Anna Maria Porter, who was also a celebrated novelist. And she was more productive in terms of publication, if slightly less acclaimed. They were referred to in the periodicals of the day as the Mrs. Porter. And they were arguably, as I said, the most famous sister novelists prior to the Brontes. Well, there are a couple of others who might be contenders for that title. I think the Porters were the most famous, had the greatest celebrity. Sharing a surname certainly helped the Porters to amplify their fame. So together and separately, the Mrs. Porter published 26 books over the course of 3 decades, and the morally uplifting strain of fiction that was then in vogue, but also working with historical content and biography in their books in new and interesting ways. So what makes the Porter sisters even more interesting is that they were pioneering single career women, as we might call them today, among the hundreds of female writers who were active in the early 19th century. The Porters were social and charismatic too, and their voluminous private letters confess painful attempts to reconcile their fame and their active and forceful literary efforts with what were supposed to be polite and passive romantic encounters with men. Yet there's been little written about them and not a full-length published biography. So what do we do with all of this information? There were dozens, hundreds, and it's not an exaggeration to say thousands of scholarly articles that could be written from this material. I've published a few. Ruth Knisevich and I worked together to write about the relationship of Jane Austen's naval brother, Charles Austen, to Jane, Anna Maria, and their brother, Robert Kerr Porter, in the 1820s, the late 1820s. And that article was published in a journal called Modern Philology, and it included some of that correspondence as its appendix. We also rewrote parts of that argument for a popular audience, and it was published in the fabulous Jane Austen's Regency World magazine. Our work ended up being featured in the New York Times Artsbeat blog too, because it included some headline-grabbing speculations about the two men's dealings in the West Indies with a famous mixed-race innkeeper who was probably also managing sex workers. The essay demonstrates that the Austens and the Porters were connected after Jane Austen's death, in part because the Porter sisters were such avid early admirers of Jane Austen's novels. Again, there's that myth of obscurity being busted. So this is the persistent myth that I'm working with these days in this research and writing that I'm doing. Sir Walter Scott was the first historical novelist. Untrue. And this is the myth busting. Scott was unfairly given credit for inventing the historical novel, which stole the thunder of countless innovators who came before him, many of them women. Now, none of the previous historical novelists were more wronged than Jane Porter, whose novelists had themselves become bestsellers. So in undoing this myth, we'd not only be giving Jane Porter a place in literary history that she deserves, recognized as a literary innovator and a pioneering single career woman, we'd also be giving her an honor that she lived long enough to witness being taken away from her. She watched, wrote about, and even tried to write back and to rebel against the little forgettings that began to take a toll on her once towering literary reputation. And to add insult to injury, the evidence points to the fact that she and Walter Scott knew each other in Edinburgh when she was a girl, living with her widowed mother, who was running a boarding house in Surgeon Square, while Scott was a student at the nearby high school. Jane's sister, Anna Maria, began publishing books first as a teenager and often under her own name. When literary success came to Jane a decade later, it was in a big way. She was the first of the family to pen a bestseller with her 1803 historical novel of war-torn Poland, Thaddeus of Warsaw. And you can see that that's recently been republished in a modern edition from University of Edinburgh Press, which I recommend that edition to you. The book proved a cultural event. Her idealized male hero, Fabia Sobieski, was loosely based on a real-life war hero, General Thaddeus Kosciuszko. He was known in England as the stalwart defender of Poland during its invasion by Russia. And that resulted in the partitioning of Poland, if you're familiar with that part of its history. But reviewers called Porter's novel in England a work of genius. It went into a second edition within a year and enjoyed nearly 100 editions by the end of the 19th century. Jane's most enduring novel was her second bestseller, The Scottish Chiefs. It repackages 13th century Scottish history and the William Wallace legend, and Porter's version glorifies Wallace as a Christian hero. It gives large roles to women in battle and in love, lots of cross-dressing, lots of pent-up desire, but also in a very morally upright and didactic framework. Now, Porter later claimed that Thaddeus of Warsaw presented the world with a new species of writing, uniting the personages of facts, of real history or biography with a combining and illustrative machinery of the imagination. Now, she pointed out that she did so 11 years before Sir Walter Scott's Waverley. She said that he adopted her style. Her claim was met with skepticism and derision by a lot of people then, but it deserves our greater sympathy today. Although Scott publicly credited several women writers with having inspired Waverley, including Maria Edgeworth and Anne McVicker Grant, he never publicly credited Porter, who was doing new work with a method that was far closer to his own. Now, when I tell people that I'm working on this book on the Porters, I'm inevitably asked, are the Porter sisters undiscovered Jane Austens? I'd love your thoughts in the chat here as to how to gently and politely answer when someone asks you that kind of question about the greatest English novelist of all time. But what I'd most like, rather than being put in a position of trying to persuade anyone that Porter deserves to displace Austen, is to convince readers that it's wrong that Porter's been forgotten and that she had her thunder stolen by Scott. I believe Scott himself participated in Porter's being left behind and her great works not continuing to be read, principally by his public silence. He never acknowledged her in print as an inspiration for his own work, although the two of them reconnected in person as adults and even exchanged letters toward the ends of their lives. So next, I'd like to share with you a short section from the middle of the biography I'm completing on Jane and Anna Maria Porter, those two wrongly forgotten novelists. Just as a little background, the material I'm about to share is drawn from the period of the Porters' lives from the early 1820s, so just after Jane Austen's death. And it's the moment when Jane Porter, her sister Maria, and their brother Robert are in their late 40s. Jane had already published 4 novels, including 2 bestsellers that I just mentioned. Maria had published an incredible 14 books. Their artist soldier writer brother, Robert, had married a Russian princess, right? No kidding. But instead of that allowing him to ascend to riches, it actually ended up being bringing up circumstances that thrust him more deeply into debt. He had also published several travel narratives and military memoirs and was working on another book. So Jane and Maria were at this moment in the early 1820s living with their elderly mother in a small, damp cottage in Surrey. And for those of you who've come to this session this day for the Jane Austen content, don't worry, I've got some of that in here for you too. So I'm now going to jump in the middle of the story and try to bring you along with me into the lives of Jane and Anna Maria Porter. You deserved a better fate than to be tortured for others, Mrs. Porter once wrote to her eldest daughter, Jane. This rueful comment wasn't about Jane's literary labors on behalf of her brother Robert and his book manuscript, but it might have applied just as well there too. Mrs. Porter would later complain that Robert, when looking at his sister, ought to say to himself, I have been the occasion of this wreck of my dear Jane's once beautiful face. Jane was working tirelessly to transcribe and edit Robert's long journal of his tour of Persia, Armenia, and ancient Babylonia, to the point of physical pain. She was also pursuing another angle to smooth a path to the success of her brother Robert's next book. Robert had asked Jane to help him secure permission to dedicate his work to King George IV, known to many who in the Austen verse as the Prince Regent. He went on to become King George IV. Now, Jane had every hope of succeeding, although it was a task she would have had mixed feelings about because she had conflicted emotions about the king himself. Everyone knew that the king lived an openly libertine life and racked up excessive debt. Thanks to his reckless overspending, the king was at one point said to have owed the unthinkable sum of £650,000. That made her brothers single-digit thousands of pounds of debt look like child's play. The king, however, was untouchable. He could just borrow more. Jane often made excuses for the king's damaged personal character. She suspected that he'd turned out to be the man he was, surrounded by rakes, flatterers, and mistresses, because he hadn't had any proper mentorship in his youth. When he was the Prince of Wales, he hadn't been taken under wing by a teacher counselor. Jane suspected that lack of proper guidance had been his undoing. I lament his fate for the sake of the nation, Jane had written to Maria many years earlier, but more so when I contemplate himself and think, what a noble mind is now overthrown. Yet despite his many faults, King George IV also had a reputation as a generous patron and connoisseur of art and artists. That's why Jane was so eager to get him interested in Robert's book. The Persian tour was Robert's most ambitious original book yet. Robert and his sisters felt it was obvious that it deserved this royal notice, as well as any other perks, titles, or accolades that might come along with it for its author. Now, getting permission for the royal dedication turned out to be a long-term project. Jane began to correspond with the man best poised to make it happen, the royal librarian, James Stanier Clark. At first, Clark expressed skepticism about approaching the king with this request from the Porters. Clark asked Jane pressing questions about the general tenor and tendency of Robert's work. Before any permission to dedicate could be secured, Clark said, he needed to know that Robert's work wouldn't give any offense abroad so as not to jeopardize British foreign interests. No assurance seemed to be enough to sway Clark. To win over the hesitating royal librarian, Jane and Maria went on a charm offensive. They made multiple visits to see him over the course of 6 months to try to convince him to approach the king for their brother's permission to dedicate. Jane assured Clark that there would be no content in the book to offend His Majesty because she herself was the editor of Robert's work. She promised she'd personally make sure that nothing of a political nature appeared in the book's pages. By the early spring of 1821, Clark sent Jane many thanks for the repeated society which you and your sister's genius so often have collected round my elbow chair, and which I never failed to introduce to the notice of the king. But whatever gossip about the Porter sisters the librarian was passing on in conversation with George IV, Clark still didn't secure permission for Robert's royal dedication. Now, Clark's surviving letters suggest he was a man with an abundance of self-regard. He was short, plump, 50 years old, and then unmarried with a penchant for chatting up authors, especially female ones. He eventually offered to show the celebrated Mrs. Porter around Carlton House at a time when the king was out of town. Now, this was the sort of grand favor that Clark could dispense without royal permission, and which might incur a sense of obligation on its recipient. The expected and virtually compulsory answer to such an invitation from the royal librarian was yes. It was the same favor Clark had offered half a dozen years earlier to Jane Austen, around the time she dedicated her novel Emma to His Majesty. No record exists of Jane Austen's visit to Carlton House in the fall of 1815. There are, however, colorful letters that describe what happened when the Mrs. Porter visited there in the spring of 1821. Jane and Maria worked with Clark to look for dates on which they might be received at Carlton House. The sisters knew the area well, having regularly walked the blocks-long mansion on Pall Mall near St. James Park during the years they lived in London. Clark's invitation offered a chance to see parts of the royal residence that would normally have been off limits, with the king away and with no less a person than the royal librarian himself as their guide. Clark suggested that the Mrs. Porter might even bring a friend or two or three female friends with them if they'd like. But as easily as the sisters could have found friends and family who'd appreciate such an invitation, Jane and Maria must have decided that the visit was too important to risk a social faux pas that might interfere with their attempt to please Clark and secure the dedication to the king. The date that Jane and Maria went to visit the Carlton House in London, April 26, 1821, would turn out to be life-changing. The sprawling neoclassical town residence of the king was a palace in everything but its name. Some even nicknamed it Carlton House Palace. Now, those who appreciated the structure said it rivaled Versailles in its beauty. Others thought its opulence overdone. The king had extensively refurbished it in order to make it rival his parents' homes at Buckingham House, as it was then called, and St. James Palace. Carlton House would eventually be torn down in 1825. But when Jane and Maria visited it, there was as yet no idea of that near future event. The main entrance of Carlton House, with its towering Corinthian pillars, was guarded by colorful sentries. A horse-drawn carriage could pull right up to the large entrance for passengers to disembark. Everything, from the first moment of arrival, was designed to be overwhelmingly grand. Visitors might enter through the great entrance hall, with its daylight streaming in from stories-high ceilings and reflecting off of striking marble columns. From there, a visitor would pass through into the famed red, green, and gold octagon room with marble busts of British politicians, many of them the king's friends, displayed on each wall. This was a vestibule room flanked by a grand staircase and a courtyard. There would have been almost too much for the eye to take in. Clark was especially eager to show the Mrs. Porter Carlton House's brightly colored staterooms, all of which had sparkling gilding thanks to lighting and large windows. These were said to be among the finest rooms in all of Europe. Clark would have led his guests through the Chinese-inspired rose satin room, the blue velvet curtained old throne room, and the unusual circular dining room. It had a hanging chandelier suspended from a ceiling, painted to look like a cloud-filled blue sky. But on the day of the Mrs. Porter's visit, Clark ended up showing only one of the sisters, Maria, around the royal residence. This was at Jane's insistence. She told her host that she'd been ill and felt physically too weak to take the tour. She asked if she might rest in the library while she waited for the two of them to return. Now, whether Jane felt ill or not, she, or indeed any book-loving person, would have been happy to spend hours by herself in that splendid library. King George IV's library wasn't just for show. His Majesty was an avid book collector and novel reader, and it was Clark's job to have the king's thousands of volumes of books bound and to keep them systematically arranged. The royal librarian was also in charge of the room's map collection, which was cleverly stored on rollers that were built right into the moldings of the bookcases for ease of unfurling and regular consultation. There, Jane would have had a chance to see in the library some of the 546 copies of 8 different newspapers delivered to Carlton House each day. Even the doors to the library were decorated to fool the eye and to look as if they too were bookcases. And Jane's ulterior motive in refusing Clark's tour of the staterooms was, if it was to explore the library on her own, then her plan was thwarted. It turned out that she wasn't alone that day in the library. Also enjoying the library's information and comforts was Sir Andrew Halliday. He was a learned, warm-hearted Scotsman whom Jane had never met before. She immediately appreciated what she called his blunt Scotch and friendly way. Sir Andrew was the personal physician to the Duke of Clarence, the king's brother. Jane and he immediately hit it off. Jane, who knew a great deal about the medical profession, quickly learned that Sir Andrew was an enthusiastic man of letters, widely read in history and historical fiction. The two of them shared a love of Scotland. Sir Andrew began to ask Jane questions about William Wallace, her hero. That's when she learned about his admiration for her novel, The Scottish Chiefs, and that she already had a friend in him through that book. By this time in her life, almost 2 decades after the publication of that best-selling novel, Thaddeus of Warsaw, Jane had participated in many such conversations with literary admirers. But this particular conversation in a royal library marked itself out as one of great importance. That's because Sir Andrew had a story to tell Jane about gossip that had circulated behind her back. He said it was a conversation that he'd been part of in the very room in which they were then seated. Just a year earlier, in 1820, Sir Andrew had been in the Carlton House library with the King and Sir Walter Scott. That year, Scott had been granted the title of baronet, but the conversation that day was literary. All of those present, Sir Andrew reported, had voiced their admiration for the anonymous Waverley novels and Tales of My Landlord, which everyone said were by Scott, although Scott himself hadn't yet admitted it publicly. Nevertheless, at some point in the conversation, Sir Andrew decided to challenge Scott about the literary influences of the unknown Waverley novelist. The physician declared bluntly to the famed author, "Well, sir, whoever may be the author of those novels, you, Sir Walter, must allow that the foundations of them all were laid by Miss Porter in her Scottish Chiefs." "I grant it," replied Sir Walter. "There is something in what you say." Now, Jane sitting in the library and listening to Sir Andrew tell her about this dialogue with Scott would have shaken her to the core. She and her sister Maria had for so long felt deeply and painfully that it was true, that the Waverley author, known as the Great Unknown, but in reality, Sir Walter Scott, had taken his inspiration and method from their historical romances. This report from Sir Andrew was the very credit that Jane had so desired and waited for. And to imagine that Scott had actually acknowledged it right there before the king. After sharing this story, Sir Andrew changed the subject. He asked Jane whether she'd ever turned her mind toward writing a book about King George IV's Hanoverian ancestors. Jane replied that she certainly hadn't. She'd read so little about them, she said. She was ashamed to tell him that such an idea had never entered her head. It turned out that the king's Hanoverian ancestors were a hobby horse of Sir Andrew's. He told Jane that although there were many interesting figures among the ancestors of the king, Sir Andrew's own favorite hero among them was Duke Christian of Brunswick-Lunenburg, born 1566 and died 1633, known in some sources as Christian the Elder. He was a great uncle of Britain's first Hanoverian king, George I, who was, of course, George IV's great-grandfather. "I can assure you," Sir Andrew told Jane, "nothing would please the king so much as you're writing a romance on that hero." This line, and Sir Andrew's manner in delivering it, struck Jane forcibly. It seemed she thought an opening that Providence was laying before her for some future advantage for herself and her family. She felt her heart move, although she tried not to let Sir Andrew see it. Jane told him, "Nothing would delight me more if the subject really struck my feelings, for without the sort of inspiration which enthusiasm gives, I could do nothing." At the end of their day together, Jane promised Sir Andrew that she would go home, read a book he'd given her about the archives of the house of Brunswick, and write back to him. She'd let him know whether she believed she could manage the subject of Duke Christian of Lenneberg in a historical romance to the king's satisfaction and her own. The two of them agreed that not to mention this matter to anybody except the royal librarian, Clark, and the king. And shortly after they met, Halliday wrote a very affectionate letter telling her that he already thought of her with a brother's feelings and hoped that he might someday be able to introduce her to his wife. He also told Jane that while once he'd imagined investigating the life of Duke Christian of Lenneberg himself, he thought, I wish I knew Miss Porter, and I wish I could get the author of the Scottish Chiefs to take an interest in the hero of romance. He'd promised her that he'd provide her with all the facts and anecdotes that he'd already collected. First, however, Jane had the editing and copying of Robert's book to complete. A month after the Carlton House visit, in May 1821, Jane finished her work on the first volume of Robert's Persian Travels. She'd run her health into the ground with a fatiguing transcribing, editing, and embellishing. It's little wonder, because the first volume of the book ran to an enormous 720 pages. The good news was that Robert, or rather Jane, had finally secured the royal dedication. Their visit to Carlton House must have charmed Clark and smoothed the way, because word came back that Clark had finally secured the king's approval for Robert's royal dedication. In the meantime, Sir Andrew Halliday was working quickly through Clark to smooth the way for Jane to write about his favorite Duke Christian. Things moved so fast behind the scenes on Jane's behalf that Clark wrote back to her just a month later in June 1821 to tell her that everything had already been taken care of. Clark informed Jane that the king had given that ingenious and most delightful writer, Jane Porter, permission to dedicate to His Majesty her intended novel on his ancestor, Duke Christian. It had taken Jane 10 months to secure permission to dedicate Robert's book to the king. It took only a handful of weeks for her to get royal permission to dedicate her own as yet unwritten historical novel about his Hanoverian ancestors through the good offices of Halliday and Clark. Now, Jane had no way of knowing it, but she wasn't the first author to be courted to write this sort of book. 6 years earlier, Clark had asked Jane Austen if she might consider writing a historical romance based on the German ancestors of the Prince Regent's soon-to-be son-in-law, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. Jane Austen had said no. She famously wrote back to Clark, "You are very, very kind in your hint as to the sort of composition which might recommend me at present, and I am fully sensible that a historical romance founded on the House of Saxe-Coburg might be much more to the purpose of profit or popularity than such pictures of domestic life in country villages as I deal in." But, Jane continued, "I could no more write a romance than an epic poem. I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I'm sure I should be hung before I finish the first chapter." Now, Jane Porter's response to the suggestion that she should write a book to please the king was entirely the opposite. The idea of writing Duke Christian, a novel about the king's royal ancestors, to dedicate it by permission to His Majesty, was not only agreeable to Jane Porter, but absolutely galvanizing. She saw her entire family's brighter economic future in it. She envisioned this book making them all comfortable for the rest of their lives. I have a hope that hereafter Mariah's old age and mine may be rendered moderately independent by some pension from His Majesty, should my work really please him, Jane wrote to her brother Robert. Given that the king was an admirer of Jane's work, and that he'd heard Sir Walter Scott express a debt to the influence of her fiction, this was a perfectly reasonable expectation on her part. Celebrated literary figures received government and royal pensions with some regularity. Now, the Porter sisters, in their late 40s, felt the creep toward late life and the threat of further bad health. They worried about how they'd make a living because, As Mariah noted, God knows how long either of us may be able to write. So that's a bit cliffhanger that I'm going to leave you on. Please follow me at any of the places listed on this slide, Twitter, Instagram, this YouTube channel, subscribe please, or find me in my author newsletter on Substack, devoney.substack.com, to keep up with the rollout of Sister Novelists and all the things that are going on in the world of Jane Austen that I'm able to bring together from things that listeners, viewers, and readers like you sent to me. So please send me your ideas. Sister Novelist is coming out in 2022 from Bloomsbury. So if you want to follow the rollout of that, do please sign up on Substack. And now for the remaining part of this hour of virtual JaneCon, please join me over on my YouTube channel, where I'll shortly be broadcasting live, taking your comments and answering your questions. So bring those with you over to the chat there. And I'm looking forward to seeing you there and to continuing to talk about women writers who hustle, myths, great rememberings, the history of strong women, and all the Janes. Thank you. See you there.